So about a week and a half ago, a new subway station opened here in Philly, and that got me thinking, what is the next big project to look forward to in Philadelphia? And that got me thinking. There isn't really any big projects in the future, so that got me thinking. If there's not any large projects opening here, what other transit is being built around the country? And that got me thinking, of course. And besides getting an ADHD diagnosis, that thinking reminded me of what is possibly the worst transit project in the United States at this present moment, and this also led me to thinking about how this project is being constructed by probably the worst well-funded transit agency in the country. Let's head to the Bay Area to talk about a transit agency and project that we have to cut, cover, and shit on. Transit systems and transit agencies are always hard to compare. No city is the same as another. Geography, diversity, wealth, and transportation planning history always play a large role in making every single metro area have a unique layout. Because of this, it's sometimes futile and egregious to directly compare statistics of two transit systems to each other to prove a point. For example, you're not going to compare Cleveland's RTA with MTA on pure ridership. Obviously, MTA in New York City will have vastly higher ridership because it's a bigger system in a more populous city with magnitudes more funding than Cleveland. But today, we're going to talk about one of the worst agencies in the country when it comes to spending their budget efficiently. And we'll make the point obvious when comparing it to other agencies of similar sizes and budgets later in this video. So today, let's talk about the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, otherwise known as San Jose's VTA. It's the early 1970s, the Vietnam War is still going, a strong-jawed president has just taken office, and a new transit system was just constructed in the Bay Area. This transit system would come to be known as BART, and it would officially bring U.S. transit into the space age with automated trains, aluminum car bodies, and live countdown clocks for stations. At the same time, multiple different private transit companies and bus companies would fail around the Bay. In 1973, a notable transit group around San Jose would finally be grouped together, taken over by local government, and turned into what we now know as the Valley Transit Authority, or VTA. VTA is known for a few things. It is one of the first agencies in North America to build a system based on light rail vehicles, which first started to become popular in the 1980s. VTA also serves a large part of what we call the Silicon Valley and generally some of the most wealthy towns and places in the United States. VTA's buses also connect with the San Francisco Airport, Caltrain, BART, Stanford, and some of the largest tech companies in the US. But one chip on VTA's shoulder has always been the lack of BART service into their territory. In the year 2000, VTA finally started looking into funding a BART extension. They eventually went on to finally pass a sales tax to help fund the first extension. The extension was to be built at the end of the Fremont line and broke ground in 2009, and finally opened for service all the way to Berryessa in 2020. But that didn't quite get BART all the way to San Jose. So remember that project in NYC for the 2nd Ave subway that ended up costing something like $4.5 billion to complete for about 2 miles of subway line? Well, that project obviously went over budget, but part of the justification for that cost was how expensive it is to construct anything in Manhattan with how built up the island is. Anyway, let's take a look at San Jose. Does this city look anywhere close to having urban fabric built up nearly as much as Manhattan? Okay, so with that in mind, how much do you think 6 miles of extension to BART is going to cost to build through San Jose? Do you think it'll be $5 billion? Maybe just a bit more expensive than the 2nd Ave subway? Because you'd be wrong. It's going to be $13 billion. Okay, so now how is that possibly going to cost that amount of money? Well, it's because VTA decided that this project needed to be built down to the core of the Earth. So let me explain. So normally, if you were to build a subway line through a city that is arguably just an overgrown suburb, you'd probably choose a method called cut and cover. In a short explanation, cut and cover is essentially just digging up part of the street, installing the subway tunnel pieces, and then reburying the tunnel under the road again. It sounds crude, but this remains one of the cheapest ways to build modern metro systems. The two downsides are that Construction does briefly block traffic, and you generally have to build the metro along a street right-of-way, and it's hard to deviate from the alignment. This type of construction is used in all sorts of modern projects, including Vancouver's Metro Broadway extension that will become part of the Yellow Line eventually. So, since San Jose is a relatively low-density city, it would make sense for VTA to use this technique to build the new BART extension. But apparently that's not what they thought. Cut and cover was deemed too disrupted by VTA because some of the businesses might be affected for a few months. So instead, they went with a bored tunnel. And this is where we run into the main issue with the project. Not only did VTA decide to bore the subway tunnels, which is already more expensive, but they also decided that instead of boring two smaller tunnels for the trains, that they were going to bore one massive tunnel and stack the trains on top of one another. It's sort of counterintuitive, but a single large bore tunnel is actually more expensive than two smaller bore tunnels. This is because the majority of the cost of tunnel boring comes from the physical cutting, moving, and removal of dirt and rock that the TBM has to push itself through. Since the VTA planners obviously failed a geometry lesson, let's go over some of this. Also, instead of in centimeters, imagine those are meters for a subway tunnel for the radiuses. So as you can see, the two smaller tunnels have a lot smaller radius, but they can still fit the trains through them, and the bigger one has to be the stacked circles. There is a 3.5 times difference between the big circle and the smaller circles when it comes to area. You could make those smaller bored tunnels almost double the radius before you actually run into the same amount of area that you have to use in the larger tunnel. Anyway, since they decided to use the massive tunnel, it will cost them extra to remove all of that extra earth that's in the way. But that's just the start of the problems. Because the tunnel is going to be bored deep below San Jose, and because it's a stacked configuration, the station boxes will have to be incredibly deep. Thankfully, VTA decided to make a hilarious animation to show off the absolute trek that you'll have to make to get to the expedition to the center of the earth. I mean, their stations. Here you can see the maze of escalators and station infrastructure that's needed to get down to the train in the first place. All of these extra costs could have been avoided with cut and cover. Plus, the end user experience is worse because a large part of your commute will literally be taking stairs for the ride. Looking at the renderings, it becomes pretty obvious that agencies like VTA are wasting money because they're so focused on the grandeur and lack of disruptions that they forget that the main goal of the project is to build an efficient transit system for a good cost. This is genuinely an American problem because we've fallen out of love with transit and are only now paying attention to it again. But with that attention, our agencies are focusing on the wrong things. They seem to think that people want giant empty concourse instead of cheaper transit that will be more frequent service. They're so focused on not minorly inconveniencing car drivers on the surface for like a month or two, so they'll instead shoot themselves in the foot by building a train that's more expensive and worse to ride on for the commute. This is even more of an epidemic with agencies like VTA, where they just aren't used to being frugal anymore. And you can really see that when you compare operating costs versus other agencies that are relatively the same size. Here's Pittsburgh. They have a lower operating cost and they carry more people than VTA. When comparing Cleveland to New York in the beginning of this video, the main thing that I want to point out is some agencies in the country are just broke, and it's really hard to increase ridership because they're literally broke. But some agencies, and there's only a few in the country, actually have a decent amount of money, like VTA, but then they still shoot themselves in the foot by doing projects that just won't bring in ridership and instead are just more of a grandeur thing that they can pat themselves on the back with. I do hope that this project is still able to be modified, even if it still is technically in the motions of construction. And as we live in a country with Cheeto Benito in charge, where we're going to be probably plunged into a recession really soon, it's probably a good idea to think about cost cutting and being a little bit more frugal with projects. This video was a little supplemental one in between my electrification mini-series, so hopefully you stick around for one of those videos coming out very soon. Also, thank you, of course, to my Patreons, and yeah, I will hopefully see you guys in the next one, and hopefully we learn some lessons here.